Limelight Arts Travels art podcast, a closer look. Sacra conversazione is an Italian term used in art history for Renaissance altarpieces of a particular type. These sacred conversations are formally composed works, usually showing the seated Virgin and Child, surrounded by saints who had a significance for the work's patron. Many Italian artists used this composition, but Venice's Giovanni Bellini is surely one of the most adept at harnessing its compositional and symbolic possibilities. In this episode, Dr. Nick Gordon and art historian Dr. Louise Marshall discuss one of Bellini's most loved works, the San Zaccaria altarpiece in Venice. An early 16th-century work that is Bellini's last documented painting, it can still be admired in the church of San Zaccaria, for which it was commissioned.
Hello, and in this episode, we'll be talking to Dr. Louise Marshall about the splendid altarpiece by Giovanni Bellini in San Zaccaria in Venice. So, Louise, why have you chosen this work to talk about?
Thanks, Nick. Well, the reason that I think this is such a great work to talk about and to highlight is because it is, I think I'm right in saying, the only Giovanni Bellini altarpiece in situ in Venice and anywhere, indeed. And by that I mean that it is still on the altar and in the church for which it was made. So that's amazing because, you know, other Giovanni Bellini altarpieces are in museums around the world and in museums in Venice, but we don't see them in the place where they were made from. And that's always an incredibly special thing because you physically experience the work as the artist and the maker intended you to experience it, in the space where it was made for, with its original surroundings. So in this case, we have both the painting and the marble frame that was made for it, and we can see the close collaboration between the painter and the sculptor to make this altarpiece. So it's very, very special. The other thing that's wonderful about this is it's one of Bellini's last works. So it's a work of his old age. Giovanni Bellini is the great luminary of Venetian Renaissance painting, 15th century, Renaissance rather than, one would say, high Renaissance, the 16th century. But this is the moment where Bellini is indeed responding to the works of the up-and-coming young Turks who are in his workshop, Titian and Giorgione, and who really do transform Venetian painting in the 16th century. This is one of Bellini's last works before he dies. It's from 1505. It's signed and dated on the painting itself so that we know, his that's when it was painted, Bellini was from this family of painters who dominated Venetian painting in the 15th century. His father and his brother, as well as himself. So the Bellini were, they had a kind of monopoly, and there was one other family, the Vivarini, who were also, again, brothers, etc. So the painting as a family business, and as a family business that was carried on through the generations, it was very common in the Renaissance and very much in Renaissance Venice. So a late work, one of Bellini's last altarpieces, it's in the church of San Zaccaria, which is right next to San Marco, so just behind San Marco, and it's actually a nun's church, a Benedictine nunnery church. And normally, nuns can't afford necessarily to pay for the works of art. But because it's so close to San Marco, and because there's a long historical connection between the nunnery and the doges, and there's an annual procession of the doges to the church every year, and the church is sort of and the convent is under the patronage of the Doge. San Zaccaria was a very wealthy nunnery, and indeed it was slightly lax, and it was slightly sort of known for not being particularly observant, the nuns. But so the church itself is this magnificent Renaissance church built in the second half of the 15th century with this wonderful marble facade that we'll see, that's this sort of stacked layers of marble, started by one architect and then finished by the great Renaissance architect Caduci. So it's really a beautiful church to see from the outside. And then you come in and the Bellini altarpiece is on your left, and it's the second altar on the left. The only thing that's a little sort of one could wish not to have happened is that the church is actually quite dark because it's covered with later paintings, 16th and 17th century paintings. So they're all done afterwards. They're not the architecture, of course, is the Renaissance architecture of the church, 15th century architecture of the church. But the rest of the church, the painting decoration, it's really the Bellini stands out. But it's on its original altar, and as we were saying, the connection between the architecture of the frame, the marble frame that surrounds this beautiful image of the Virgin and Child enthroned with 4 saints standing on either side and a music-playing angel at the foot of the throne playing the viola. That's all done at the same time. And in terms of who was responsible for the design, I think probably the sculptor would have done in collaboration with Bellini, because what is so striking about this is that the marble frame, which is in the form of pilasters with an arch, supporting an arch, and then marble columns in front of those pilasters, and they stand to either side of the altar, and then they support a cornice which does have like a triangular pediment on top of it. The one that we see is slightly later, but it would have had an original triangular pediment. So these is the sort of the vocabulary of classical architecture that by now has been introduced into Venice, being used to frame the setting for the holy figures gathered together, and it's really striking that the design of the pilaster, the actual architecture of the frame, is the same exact architecture that is painted, because the Virgin and Child and the saints are shown standing in a chapel with the same order of the, I guess it's an Ionic order of the pilasters upholding a cornice, and the Virgin's throne is placed in front of an apse with a curve, and then with the beautiful mosaic fictive illusion of a mosaic in the conch, the semicircle of the apse. And that is painted by Bellini as if it is made of gold mosaic, with a beautiful vegetation, a scrolling pattern in it. And of course, that is Bellini as painter referring back to the medieval and Byzantine tradition of Venice as a city that is both, the great trading entrepot between East and West, where Venice is always looking towards the Eastern Empire and to Constantinople, and indeed promotes itself as a new Constantinople. And so San Marco, the Doge's church, which is very close, is covered in gold Byzantine mosaic. And so Bellini here is situating his heavenly gathering in a chapel that is, as it were, a Venetian chapel. So it's as if they're in Venice. And then you can see that the painted architecture is this curve of the arches, which comes forward in space to illusionistically link up as if with the actual pilasters. So it's to create this illusion of a continuous space, an actual chapel that extends illusionistically into the space of the altarpiece. But what the other thing that we now see is that, unfortunately, the painting is damaged because, of course, all these wonderful paintings have a history through time, the vicissitudes and ravages of time, and so in this case, this painting is so famous that when Napoleon conquered Venice in the late 18th century, the Napoleonic troops cut out the painting from its frame and shipped it off to Paris as booty. Then it was indeed would have originally been oil painted on wood, on panel, but sometime in its history in France, in Paris, it was transferred to canvas, and it was also cut down. So it had a strip cut off the top and a strip cut off the bottom, maybe to fit it into some new frame or something. But so when it was returned finally to Venice in the early 19th century, after, Napoleon's defeat and the Allies, divide the spoils of war up, and a lot of the looted paintings from Italy come back, although not all. So the Louvre still has paintings that were taken from Italy, which I always think is terrible that they didn't restore all of them. So it was put back into its original frame. And originally in the 19th century, they did actually, it was smaller, when it came back, and it had this strip cut off the top. And in the 19th century, they restored it by adding another strip along the top and another strip along the bottom that continued Bellini's painting, so that we would have seen the vault of this fictive chapel that he created. But modern restoration emphasizes the original of the artist and doesn't want to look at, or doesn't want to make unclear the division between the original and the 19th century restorations. So modern policy of restoration has been to take those away. And so now we look at it, there's just a blank space at the top and a little bit of a blank space at the bottom. So it doesn't quite fit anymore, and the illusion is not complete.
If they were there, just how greater that sense of fictive space that would be created. And it also, though, I think draws attention to Bellini's extraordinary skill as a painter in the way that he handles light. Like when you were talking about the mosaic, to not just do a lazy version of a painted mosaic, but to actually capture the play of light. And noticing too that in its current when we see it today, you've got this very warm, gentle light that illuminates the figures inside that illusionistic space. And then you've got this cooler space of the stone outside, almost like there's a visual threshold that we're crossing into, and not just a linear one.
Yes, well, I mean, the whole point of having of this link between the actual architecture of the frame and the painted architecture of the setting is at once to connect the holy figures to us standing in the church in front of them, but also, of course, as you say, it's a separate realm. So there's it's the place where the Christ and his mother and the saints and the angels are. So it is connected to us, but it's also a place slightly apart. And the other way that is always in Renaissance art conveyed is the fact that they're always a little bit above eye height. So we don't look eye to eye at the Virgin and the saints. We look up at them. They're in an elevated space, but at the same space, a space that is connected to us. So, and of course, so that, this architecture is envisaged as extending from the real space of where we stand into the picture as this kind of continuum. So it's the point of the architecture, the frame is the point where it's the real goes into the fictional, and so it's this, the threshold, between the real and the illusionistic, but it is a continuous which connects us as worshippers with the objects of our worship, that the Virgin and the saints are really there. And they are gathered together in this grouping that art historians talk about as a Sacra conversazione, that is a sacred conversation, which is an art historical term which does have roots in Renaissance terminology, but it means this standard subject of an altarpiece, which is the Virgin and Child gathered together with the saints. And, this is an altarpiece is really a backdrop for the ceremony of the Mass on the altar. And the Virgin and Child is the most standard subject of a Renaissance altarpiece, because the Eucharist, the ceremony of the Eucharist or the Mass, is about Christ, the body of Christ becoming real, that the bread literally transforms into Christ's body and the wine literally transforms into Christ's blood. And that is like a birthing, it's a coming to being of Christ. And so the Virgin and Child is that image of Christ being born, Christ actually, being made flesh. So it's kind of like you can't see the wine becoming, you have to believe it. You can't see the wine becoming blood and the bread becoming flesh. But this image of the Virgin and Child makes visible what you believe in faith. But so it is this sort of standard subject matter. In earlier altarpieces, they would have been divided in panels, but here they're all together, they share the one space, which is also open. This is new in Bellini, that his chapel is not closed. It's like a pergola with views of the landscape at either side. And that's what also gives it this wonderful light that you're talking about. This idea that the natural light is falling from left to right and it bathes these figures in this kind of incredible glow, because you can see how the wall, the fictive wall of the apse, is dark on the left and lit at the right. So the light is really coming from, envisaged as coming from left to right. And I think that would link with the actual windows in the church, that there's a window in the facade, and so the light is coming, the literal light in the church comes from left to right, and the painted light comes from left to right. And it's another way of tying the illusion and making it more real and believable. But also what is so distinct to Bellini, and that you were responding to, is how golden and glowing and
very rare to see it so.
Is just so warm. And that is Bellini and oil and his colour, his handling of oil. The figures are very monumental. We have from left to right, we have St. Peter, St. Catherine of Alexandria on the left-hand side, the Virgin and Child lifted above on their marble throne with the angel in front of them sort of at the step. And then on the other side, St. Lucy and St. Jerome, and the colours are very rich. Like Peter is in blue with yellow, which are his traditional colours. St. Jerome on the far right is in the red of the cardinal's colours. The Virgin is wearing this beautiful blue robe. Bellini is the master of oil paint, and particularly here, he's really responding to the manipulation of oil, the way oil, the layering of oil that you can do, the glazes, and the way it would be painted on a white ground, and the light, the actual light, filters through the layers and hits the white underground, and then is sort of reflected back up through the layers again, and that really does give it a glow. It's, you think that there's a sort of an interior glow. But the last thing that really is so striking about this altarpiece is how solemn and calm and meditative it is, because none of the figures are looking at each other, and none of them are looking at us. And so that's why I said it's somewhat ironic that it's called a sacred conversation, but they're not conversing. And it's not really about conversation. It's not, oh, hello, Jesus, how are you today? That here's St. Peter saying, how are you to the Virgin or something. it is very much these saints gathered together in the presence of the Virgin and Child in the heavenly court, but meditating on, it's really like each of them is absorbed in their own thoughts, and they kind of look down. St. Jerome is reading his book because he was the great translator of the Bible. He translated it from Greek into Latin, and the book that was used, the copy, the version of the Bible that they use is Jerome's translation, the Vulgate. And the angel is playing, so we have the viola, so we have to imagine that the space is filled with the celestial harmony of the angelic music, but they're each thinking of Christ's sacrifice and of, and then the Virgin and Child are bathed in this gorgeous light, but they're very solemn because, of course, Christ, this beautiful baby shown naked, as many babies are, the Christ child is, because to emphasize his vulnerability, the reality that he is a real human baby, shown like a baby, with real baby flesh, but at the same time, yes, chubby, but at the same time, much more serious and solemn than any baby would, and blessing. And he knows his mission. It's about Christ deliberately came, he voluntarily accepted the charge and came to earth to offer his life for the sake of human salvation. His death wipes out the sin of, Adam and Eve, or the original sin, pays the penalty for original sin for them. But they're very solemn, and even that the throne behind has a red back, and red, of course, the colour of blood, the colour of sacrifice. So he's the sacrificial lamb who's going to be slaughtered, So it is this sort of meditative, solemn, calm, everyone in their own thoughts, everyone united in thinking about what is going to happen, Christ's future, but which is, of course, joyous in the end, but it's tragic along the way, as it were. And so that's really this, and the kind of the way that they're all gathered together and the handling of the paint and the treatment of the light gives it this incredible sense of luminosity. And it is really almost that you can sort of see the light, see the atmosphere, and the whole thing is just bathed in this gorgeous golden glow that creates this sort of exalted sense of the heavens and of the serious subject matter, but which is also informed by the natural world. So we get these glimpses of the trees and the landscape at either side. So it's also this sense of Christ coming into the world and sort of sanctifying the world. So it's the heaven, but it's also the world. And it's, it is really a spectacular altarpiece, and we are so lucky that it's still in its church and that we can just go in and see it. So it will be one of the highlights of our trip.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.